There's a ledger entry from the San Juan Mining Company, dated November 14th, 1892, written in the hand of a superintendent named Clayton Marsh. The entry is brief, clinical in its language, the kind of notation meant to satisfy distant investors who never set foot in the mountains. It reads, "Operation suspended at Shaft 7. Men refuse descent. Cause undetermined. Recommend closure pending investigation." Beneath this, in different ink, darker and pressed harder into the page, someone, presumably Marsh himself, had added a single line that was later struck through, though still legible under lamplight. "They will not go down because something will not come up." The line was never explained. The investigation never occurred. Shaft 7 was sealed with timber and rubble by the end of that month, and within a year, the entire camp of Red Bell, Colorado, had been abandoned. The building stood empty through the winter of 1893. By 1895, most had collapsed under snow. By 1900, there was nothing left but foundation stones and the dark mouth of a sealed mine that no one in the county would discuss. This is not a story about what was found in Shaft 7. This is a story about what refused to leave it. The autumn of 1892 marked the final surge of Colorado's silver boom, a fever that had gripped the San Juan Mountains for nearly 2 decades. Towns had erupted across the high country, places with names like Silverton, Ouray, Telluride, each one a constellation of canvas tents and raw lumber clinging to slopes that had known only silence before the prospectors arrived. Red Bell was smaller than most, perched at nearly 11,000 feet in a narrow valley where the aspens turned gold early, and the first snows came in September. It had begun 3 years prior when a surveyor named Gideon Foss discovered a promising seam of silver bearing, or along a granite ridge. The San Juan Mining Company purchased a claim, brought in equipment by mule train, and by the summer of 1890, Red Bell had grown to a population of nearly 200 souls. Miners, engineers, cooks, laundresses, a company doctor, and a fluctuating number of others drawn by rumor and desperation. It was not an easy place to live. The altitude made men breathless and sapped strength from even the simplest tasks. Water had to be hauled from a creek a quarter-mile below the camp. Supplies came in twice monthly when the trails permitted, and during winter, Red Bell was entirely cut off from the outside world for weeks at a time. The work itself was brutally hard. 10-hour shifts underground, drilling and blasting through rock, hauling ore to the surface in wooden buckets, breathing dust that settled in the lungs and never quite left. But the men endured because the silver was good, and the company paid on time, and for most of them, there was nowhere else to go. By the late summer of 1892, the camp had expanded operations. 7 shafts now descended into the mountain at various points along the ridge, each one named simply by number. Shafts 1 through 5 had proven profitable. Shaft 6 had been abandoned early due to flooding. Shaft 7 was the newest, driven deeper than any of the others, following a promising vein that angled steeply down into the mountain's core. It was Shaft 7 where the trouble began, though no one could say precisely when. The first mentions appear in letters home, the kind of correspondence that miners sent to families they had left behind in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Missouri. These letters, preserved in archives and historical societies, are matter-of-fact in tone, filled with mundane complaints about weather and wages. But scattered among them, beginning in late August, are sentences that pause the reader. A man named Thomas Ridley wrote to his wife in St. Louis, "The new shaft is deep now, deeper than any we have worked before. The air is different down there. I cannot explain it well. It is not foul, but it is not right either." Another miner, whose name is recorded only as J. Calloway, mentioned in a letter to his brother, "Some of the boys say they hear things in 7. I have heard nothing myself, but I do not like to be the last man out at the end of shift." These were men accustomed to darkness, to the groan of timbers and the distant drip of groundwater, to the occasional rockfall and the ever-present danger of gas. They were not men prone to nervousness. Yet something in Shaft 7 had begun to unsettle them in ways they struggled to articulate. By September, the unease had spread. The shifts in Shaft 7 were typically manned by crews of 8 to 10 men, working in pairs at different depths along the main tunnel and its offshoots. The work followed a rhythm: drill, blast, clear, haul, repeat. Conversations were sparse, drowned out by the percussion of hammers against steel, the clang of tools, the creak of the hoist mechanism that lowered and raised men and materials. But men notice when the rhythm changes. A driller named Samuel Pryor mentioned to the shift foreman, a man called Horace Lund, that he kept finding his tools moved. Not stolen, simply moved. He would set a hammer down beside the ore cart, turn to adjust a timber brace, and find the hammer 5 feet away, resting against a tunnel wall. He would place his water flask on a ledge and return minutes later to discover it sitting in the center of the track, where it would have been crushed by the cart if he had not noticed. Lund told him to pay better attention. Pryor said nothing further, but he began keeping his tools on his person at all times. Others reported similar small disturbances. A lantern extinguished without cause. A rope coiled differently than had been left. The sensation, described by more than one man, of having just missed seeing someone move out of sight around a bend in the tunnel. These incidents were easy to dismiss individually. Underground work played tricks on perception. Shadows moved strangely in lamplight. Exhaustion distorted memory. But the repetition was harder to ignore. By the 3rd week of September, men had begun to avoid working alone in the deeper sections of Shaft 7. This was a problem, because the richest ore was at the farthest extent of the tunnel, nearly 400 feet below the surface, and hauling it required men to make solo trips back and forth between the working face and the main hoist. The shift supervisor, Clayton Marsh, the same man who would later write the ledger entry, called a meeting on the evening of September 22nd. The meeting took place in the company office, a one-room structure warmed by a pot-belly stove. 15 men attended, those who worked Shaft 7 regularly. Marsh asked directly, what was the problem? The men were reluctant to speak. Finally, a young miner named Daniel Oakes said that no one wanted to be at the bottom of the shaft alone. When Marsh pressed him, Oakes said it was not something he could explain, only that the feeling down there had changed. He used the word occupied. Marsh asked what he meant by occupied. Oakes said that the bottom of the shaft felt like a room where someone had just been standing and might still be standing, just out of sight. The other men did not contradict him. Marsh was a practical man, a veteran of a dozen mining camps, and he did not put stock in feelings. He proposed that men work in closer proximity, that no one should be more than shouting distance from another crew member. The men agreed to this. The meeting ended, but the adjustment did not solve the problem. October brought the first hard frost, and the aspens lost their leaves in a single week, leaving the slopes around red, bell, bare, and gray. The mornings were bitter, and men descended into the shafts as much for warmth as for wages. Underground, the temperature remained constant, cool but not cold, and the deeper you went, the more the mountains seemed to insulate you from the world above. In Shaft 7, the work continued, but the atmosphere had deteriorated. Men began refusing to take the last shift of the day, the shift that ended after dark. The company had always run 3 shifts, dawn, midday, and evening, but by mid-October, the evening crew in Shaft 7 had to be filled by volunteers offered extra pay, and even then, there were not always enough. The reason, as it emerged in fragments from various accounts, was the sound. It was not a loud sound. That was the problem. A loud sound to be identified, investigated, explained. This was something else. A low, irregular noise that seemed to come from the deepest part of the tunnel, beyond where the men were working. Some described it as a scraping, metal on stone. Others said it was more like breathing, slow and labored. One man insisted it was neither, but rather the sound of something heavy being dragged. Samuel Pryor, the driller who had reported his tools being moved, told another miner, a man named Eustace Perry, that had heard it clearly one evening when he was alone at the ore face. He said it came from farther down the tunnel, from a section that had not yet been excavated, where the tunnel ended in solid rock. Perry asked what he did. Pryor said he left immediately. Perry asked if he told Marsh. Pryor said there was no point. Marsh would say it was timber settling, or air moving through crevices, or any number of rational things. And maybe it was, but Pryor did not believe it, and he would not go down there alone again. This conversation was recorded in a letter Perry sent to a cousin in Illinois, dated October 19th, 1892. The letter is part of a private collection, but excerpts have been published in regional histories. Perry's handwriting is careful and unhurried, the tone neither hysterical nor dismissive. He simply reported what had been told and added, "I have not heard the sound myself, but I see the change in Sam, and it is not a change for the better." By late October, the situation had worsened in ways that could no longer be ignored. 2 men had quit outright, forfeiting wages owed, and leaving Red Bell on foot rather than continue working Shaft 7. A third miner, a man named Joseph Tarrant, had refused to descend one morning, standing at the shaft entrance and telling Marsh flatly that he would work any other tunnel in the camp but not that one. Marsh had threatened termination. Tarrant had said that was acceptable. He was reassigned to Shaft 4. The men who remained were visibly rattled. They descended more slowly, spoke less, kept their lanterns burning brighter and longer than necessary. Productivity dropped. The amount of ore being hauled to the surface had fallen by nearly a third, not because the vein had thinned, but because the men were spending less time at the working face. Marsh, under pressure from the San Juan Mining Company's regional director, decided to investigate the tunnel himself. He made a descent on the morning of October 28th, accompanied by Horace Lund and a miner named Benjamin Cray. All 3 carried lanterns and a length of rope. They descended the main shaft by hoist, a slow, creaking descent that took several minutes, and then proceeded on foot down the sloping tunnel toward the deepest excavation. Marsh kept a journal, a small leather-bound book that he used for both company records and personal observations. His entry for that day survives, housed now in the Colorado Historical Archive. The handwriting is steady, precise, the language spare. He noted the condition of the timbers, sound, the air quality, acceptable, the tunnel walls, stable. Everything, he wrote, appeared normal. They proceeded to the ore face, nearly 400 feet from the hoist, and examined the working area. Tools were neatly arranged. The drilling pattern was correct. There was no sign of structural instability or gas accumulation. And yet, Marsh wrote, we stood at the face for some minutes. Lund inspected the ceiling braces. Cray examined the ore cart tracks. I listened. I do not know what I expected to hear, but I heard nothing unusual, only the silence of deep earth and our own breathing, and the faint drip of water somewhere distant. After a time, Cray remarked that he did not like the feel of the place. I asked him to clarify. He could not. Lund said nothing. But I observed that he kept his lantern raised and turned frequently, as though expecting someone to approach from behind. They remained for 15 minutes, then returned to the surface. Marsh's conclusion, written that evening, was that the men's concerns were psychological in nature, likely the result of isolation and exhaustion. He recommended shorter shifts and increased ventilation. He did not recommend closing the shaft. But 3 days later, something happened that changed his mind. The incident occurred on the evening of October 31st, during the last shift of the day. The crew in Shaft 7 that evening consisted of 6 men, working in pairs at different points along the tunnel. The deepest pair, Samuel Pryor and a miner named Lucas Hearn, were at the ore face, drilling in preparation for the next blast. What happened was reported afterward by Pryor, in a statement he gave to Marsh, and later in a letter he sent to his family. The two accounts align closely. Pryor and Hearn had been working for just over an hour when Pryor became aware of a change in the air. He described it as a sudden coolness, not a draft exactly, but a drop in temperature that seemed to come from deeper in the tunnel, from the unexcavated rock beyond the ore face. He mentioned it to Hearn, who nodded but said nothing. They continued working. A short time later, Pryor heard the sound. It was unmistakable now, a slow, rhythmic scraping, Stone against stone, coming from the tunnel wall to their left, a section of solid granite that had not been breached. He stopped drilling. Hearn stopped as well. They listened. The sound continued, steady and deliberate, as though something on the other side of the rock was moving parallel to them, keeping pace. Pryor called out, asking if anyone else was in the tunnel. There was no response. The sound stopped. They waited. The silence was complete, the kind of silence that feels pressed against the ears. Pryor raised his lantern and stepped closer to the wall, examining the granite for cracks or fissures that might explain the noise. There were none. The rock was seamless. And then Pryor wrote, he felt it. He described it as a presence, immediate and undeniable, standing directly on the other side of the stone, not inches away, but there, in a space that should have been solid rock. He said he could feel it waiting, the way you feel another person's attention on you in a crowded room. Hearn grabbed his arm and pulled him back. Neither man spoke. They gathered their tools and left the face, walking quickly but not running, because running in a mine tunnel is dangerous and can cause panic. They reached the hoist and signaled to be brought up. The other two crews, hearing the hoist activate, assumed the shift was ending early and followed. On the surface, Pryor reported what had happened to Marsh. Marsh questioned Hearn separately. Hearn confirmed the account. He added that when they had turned to leave, he had glanced back once and seen, or thought he saw, a shadow cross the tunnel behind them, moving from one wall to the other, though there was nothing there to cast it. Marsh wrote in his journal that night, "I do not know what is in Shaft 7. I do not know if there is anything in Shaft 7. But I cannot in good conscience send men into a place where they believe they are not alone." The decision to close Shaft 7 temporarily was made on November 2nd. Marsh informed the men that operations would be suspended for 1 week, while the tunnel was inspected by a specialist from Denver, a mining engineer named Albert Driscoll, who had experience with unusual geological conditions and structural anomalies. Driscoll arrived in Red Bell on November 7th. Traveling by stagecoach and then mule. He was a methodical man in his 50s, with a reputation for skepticism and precision. He spent the first day reviewing the camp's records, examining maps of the tunnel system, and interviewing the miners who had worked Shaft 7. On the morning of November 8th, he descended into the shaft, accompanied by Marsh, Lund, and a young engineer named Peter Colfax, who had been hired to document the inspection. They carried surveying equipment, lanterns, and notebooks. The descent was uneventful. Driscoll examined every aspect of the tunnel: the timbers, the rock strata, the air composition, the drainage. He took measurements, made sketches, and dictated observations to Colfax, who wrote them down in shorthand. Everything was recorded with scientific precision. They reached the face just after midday. Driscoll spent nearly an hour there, tapping the walls, checking for hollow spaces, testing the rock for unusual mineral content. He found nothing irregular. It was as they were preparing to return to the surface that the event occurred. Colfax's account, written later that day and preserved in his personal papers, is the most detailed. He described how the group had been packing up their equipment when Driscoll paused, turning slowly to face the far end of the tunnel, the section that terminated in unexcavated granite. Driscoll asked if anyone else heard it. No one had. Driscoll remained still, listening. Then he said, quietly, that there was something on the other side of the rock. He said it was tapping. Marsh and Lund exchanged glances. Colfax listened but heard nothing. Driscoll walked toward the rock face, slowly, his lantern raised. He stopped a few feet away and placed his hand flat against the granite. According to Colfax, Driscoll stood that way for nearly a minute, his palm pressed to the stone, his head tilted slightly as though listening. Then he withdrew his hand quickly and stepped back. He said very clearly, "There is something behind this wall." Marsh asked what he meant. Driscoll did not answer immediately. He stood looking at the wall, and Colfax noted that the engineer's face had gone pale, though the lantern light made it difficult to be certain. Finally, Driscoll said that he had felt movement, not vibration from above, not the settling of rock, but something deliberate. He said it had responded to his touch. Lund suggested it might be water, an underground stream trapped in a cavity. Driscoll shook his head. He said, "Water does not wait." The group returned to the surface. Driscoll did not speak during the ascent. Once above ground, he told Marsh that Shaft 7 should be sealed immediately. He offered no detailed explanation, stating only that the tunnel had encountered a geological feature that made continued excavation unsafe. When Marsh pressed for specifics, Driscoll said he would include his findings in a formal report. That report was never filed. Driscoll left Red Bell the following morning, 2 days earlier than planned. Colfax noted in his journal that the engineer had seemed profoundly unsettled and that he had refused to discuss what he had felt in the tunnel. Colfax himself admitted that while he had not experienced anything unusual, he had no desire to return to Shaft 7. Marsh received a telegram from Driscoll 3 days later. It contained a single sentence: "Recommend permanent closure. Do not excavate further." The San Juan Mining Company accepted Driscoll's recommendation without protest, which in itself was unusual. Mining operations were expensive to establish, and a promising vein was not abandoned lightly. Yet Shaft 7 was sealed on November 14, 1892, with minimal ceremony. Timber beams were placed across the entrance, and rubble was hauled in to fill the upper section of the shaft. No explanation was given to the miners beyond geological instability. Work continued in the other shafts through the winter, but Red Bell was never the same. Men began leaving. Some cited other opportunities, claims opening elsewhere in the San Juans. Others simply packed their belongings and left without notice. By January of 1893, the camp's population had dropped to fewer than 80. Productivity declined further. The San Juan Mining Company, facing falling silver prices and rising operational costs, announced in March that Red Bell would be closed indefinitely. By May, the camp was deserted. The buildings were left standing, as was common. Mining camps often experience cycles of abandonment and revival, depending on ore prices and economic conditions. But Red Bell was never revived. The structure stood empty through the 1890s, weathering the harsh winters and brief summers. Prospectors occasionally passed through, but none chose to reopen the shafts. Local ranchers, whose cattle grazed in the lower valleys, began to avoid the area, though they offered no specific reason. A surveyor named Miles Garrett, working for the U.S. Geological Survey, visited the site in the summer of 1898. His field notes describe Red Bell as thoroughly abandoned and mentioned that the entrance to Shaft 7 remained sealed. He noted that the local population in Silverton, the nearest town, seemed reluctant to discuss the camp. When he inquired about the closure, he was told variously that the silver had run out, that the company had gone bankrupt, or that the elevation made operations impractical. No one mentioned the events of 1892. Garrett attempted to locate the San Juan Mining Company's records, but found that the company had dissolved in 1894, and its archives had been dispersed or lost. He did, however, locate Albert Driscoll, the mining engineer who had inspected Shaft 7. Garrett wrote to Driscoll requesting an interview. Driscoll declined, stating in a brief reply that he had no information of value to provide. The physical site of Red Bell deteriorated steadily. By 1905, most of the structures had collapsed under snow. The shafts, including Shaft 7, were overgrown with scrub and aspen saplings. The site became a footnote in regional mining histories, mentioned primarily as an example of the boom and bust cycle that characterized Colorado's silver era. Yet the story did not entirely disappear. In 1911, a Denver newspaper published a short article titled "Ghost Camps of the San Juans," which included a passing reference to Red Bell. The article mentioned that the camp had been abandoned under mysterious circumstances, and that local residents believed the mines were haunted. The article cited no sources and offered no details, but it was reprinted in several other papers, and the idea took root. By the 1920s, Red Bell had entered local folklore. Stories circulated about miners who had heard voices underground, about shafts that had to be sealed because men refused to enter them, about something that lived deep in the mountain. These stories were vague, embellished, disconnected from the historical record, but they persisted. The truth, such as it can be known, exists in fragments. Marsh's journal entries, now held by the Colorado Historical Society, letters from miners to their families, scattered across archives in 5 states. Colfax's account of the inspection, preserved by his descendants. These documents are brief, matter-of-fact, and incomplete. They do not provide answers. They only confirm that something happened in Shaft 7 in the autumn of 1892, something that could not be explained and could not be ignored. There is a map in the Denver Public Library's Western History Collection, hand-drawn in 1893, that shows the San Juan mining district. Red Bell is marked with a small dot and a notation, closed. Someone at a later date has written in pencil beside that, "Do not reopen." The identity of the person who added that note is unknown. The handwriting does not match any of the surviving company documents. It is possible it was added by a surveyor or a prospector, or simply someone who knew the camp's reputation and wanted to leave a warning. The map has been digitized, and the pencil note is clearly visible in high-resolution scans, but its origin remains a mystery. In 1976, a group of amateur historians and spelunkers attempted to locate Shaft 7. They used old survey maps and a description from Garrett's 1898 field notes. They found the approximate site, but the entrance was impossible to identify. A century of rockfall, erosion, and vegetation had erased all surface traces. They abandoned the search after 2 days. A decade later, another group tried, this time using metal detectors to locate remnants of iron equipment that might mark the shaft location. They found scattered debris, rusted nails, fragments of an oar cart, but nothing conclusive. One member of the group, a geologist from Boulder, noted in his report that the area retained an unusual atmospheric quality, which he attributed to elevation and wind patterns. The site is now part of the Uncompahgre National Forest. It is unmarked, unnamed, and largely forgotten. Hikers occasionally pass through the area, following trails that wind through the high country. They do not know they are walking over the remains of Red Bell. They do not know about Shaft 7. But sometimes, very rarely, there are reports. A hunter, camping alone in the aspens, who wakes in the night to the sound of scraping rock, distant and rhythmic, coming from beneath the ground. A backpacker who describes feeling watched while crossing a particular ridge, though no one else is visible for miles. These reports are anecdotal, unverified, easy to dismiss. People hear things in the wilderness. The mind creates patterns in silence. There's always a rational explanation, and yet the reports come from the same area, season after season, year after year. They describe the same sensations, the same unease. Clayton Marsh's final journal entry, dated November 13, 1892, the night before Shaft 7 was sealed, contains a single line that was not struck through, not edited, not explained. He wrote, "Something should not be disturbed. We disturb something, and it will not let us forget." The journal ends there. Shaft 7 remains sealed. The mountain remains silent. And in the archives and letters and ledgers and forgotten field notes, the words remain. Something will not come up. No one has ever explained what that meant. No one has tried to find out.